with our media chapter. So just a quick refresher, you can get your skeletal outline from Schoology, and we started this chapter on Friday. We talked through the First Amendment some, we'll come back to that. We talked through a few different types of media as a business, advertising, three big functions: news, entertainment, shaping public opinion. We talked about the evolution from newspapers, yellow journalism, sensationalism, muckraking, all that good stuff. So we're going to continue with the evolution of media today. That's where we'll pick up today. Friday, we talked about newspapers. One of the next big innovations in media is radio. Now you've got elected officials able to reach out directly to voters and speak to them directly. Of course, the president most famous for use of radio would be Franklin Roosevelt, with the use of his fireside chats during the Depression. Now people can tune in from their homes and hear the president speak directly to them in their living rooms. He had this very reassuring but confident tone where he would encourage people that the end of the Depression is right around the corner, that his administration is on top of it, and it's effective in calming people's fears. This is a president, again, reaching out directly and communicating with American voters. Then we evolve again into television. Of course, we've got television advertisements. We've got the first televised presidential debate between Richard Nixon and John Kennedy in 1960. And the common conventional wisdom is that people who listened to the debate on the radio believed that Nixon won because he sounded like he understood the policy better, he sounded more confident, but people who watched the debate on television believed that Kennedy won because he was this younger, more attractive, he was well tanned, he allowed them to use television makeup on him, whereas Nixon refused. And so it seemed like television viewers gravitated toward Kennedy, and that had an impact on who people thought won. And of course, television has played a huge role in presidential campaigns for sure since then, whether it's debates or advertisements or candidates and members of their campaign going on various news programs, going on even entertainment programs, showing up on Saturday Night Live or some of the late night shows as a way of, again, trying to reach out directly to voters. Television itself evolves into 24-hour news networks. We talked on Friday about CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, that television is now the place where the plurality of Americans say this is their number one source of news is television. Even ahead of internet, even in this internet-driven era, more people say they get their news from television. Internet is catching up, but television is still on top. Of course, with the internet, again, we talked about this some on Friday, but you've got blogs, low barrier to entry. You've got news sites that are online only. So things like Breitbart or HuffPost, things like Politico, which is sort of the politics insider news website. Lots of the drama and the intrigue on Capitol Hill gets reported on Politico first. You've got a lot more extremist content if you're going online, things like InfoWars, which are full of misinformation and disinformation and very radical points of view. Social media, which don't generate much content themselves, but provide platforms for the sharing of content. Things like Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, Snapchat, of course, YouTube providing a place for content creation. And you've got media or news related YouTube channels one of the things that we mentioned when we talked about internet on Friday was that this is a relatively low barrier to entry. It's easy to start a YouTube channel. It's easy to start a social media presence. Same thing goes for podcasts, which we talked about. I had you listen to a couple on Friday. Relatively low barrier to entry. Anyone can get a microphone, start a podcast, and start talking about the news and current events, providing, even if they can't break news, they can provide analysis and commentary. So, three big roles that the media fulfills, and these are terms. These three terms that you see here in red are words that the AP exam will use. They will expect you to know what these three words mean without giving you much context. So let's talk through what these three roles mean. The first role of the media is the gatekeeper. Sometimes this is called agenda setting. Remember, another thing we've mentioned before when it comes to media is that you don't have an infinite amount of time or space. What you are writing about or talking about on your newspaper or on your program, on your podcast, you've got a limited amount of time, limited amount of resources. So you have to prioritize what is the most important. You have to set the agenda. There's only so much space in a newspaper, only so much space in a magazine, only so much time, even for a 24-hour news network. They've got to determine, how are we going to fill this hour? What are we going to talk about? So that decision of what do we talk about? What do we prioritize? What do we talk about first at the beginning of the show? And what do we talk about more towards the end? What's on the front page of the newspaper versus what's buried halfway in? All of these are decisions that have to do with the media setting the agenda. The most important stuff, the stuff that is dramatic and is going to grab people's attention, you want that first because you want them to tune in and stay tuned in. You want them to download and keep listening. You want them to click and keep reading. And you want them over on the suggested reading, clicking again. So the gatekeeper role, you're setting the agenda. You're determining the course of the conversation. So after a mass shooting, maybe you run a bunch of stories about gun control. Of course, over the past year and a few months, the media has spent a lot of time placing COVID-19 at the top of the agenda. Anytime there's an election, that's going to be front and center. Maybe, right now we're talking a lot about vaccinations, immunizations. After the killing of George Floyd, the media spent a lot of time talking about policing. So the media setting the agenda, setting the course of the political conversation. And there's some give and take between the media and politicians. Politicians have to respond to what's in the media. They've got to be able to talk about it, but they can also push back and say, they can try to use the media and say, you should be talking about this. So there's a little bit of a relationship there between the media and politicians. But as the media brings something to people's attention, politicians and policymakers are going to have to respond. So they act as agenda setters, they act as the gatekeepers. During an election, media acts as the scorekeeper. The big question: who's winning? We have a debate. Who won the debate? We're having primaries, candidates are competing for delegates. Okay, who has more delegates? Who's got momentum? The reading uses this term, the big mo. That just means who's got momentum. So this time last year, you've got a bunch of Democratic candidates. Well, by this time, there weren't a bunch anymore. But by about February of last year, you had a bunch of Democratic candidates, and it looked like Bernie Sanders had momentum. Then Joe Biden comes in, swoops in on Super Tuesday, takes a bunch of delegates. Suddenly, he's got the momentum. As we're headed into the general election, we're doing polling, looking at who's winning. That's the big question of the horse race. Scorekeeper journalism or horse race journalism is not about policy. It's just about who is winning, trying to tell us who's going to win this election. And of course, it's not always accurate, as you can see from this projection that was shortly before the 2016 election. Things that have a 33% chance still sometimes occasionally happen. So, gatekeeper, setting the agenda, this is what we're talking about. Scorekeeper, who's winning. And then watchdog, we're keeping an eye on government, especially for scandals, monitoring personal behavior, monitoring whether or not people in office are fulfilling their promises. So, Joe Biden campaigned to do this thing. How come this thing hasn't been done yet? And that's something that a White House and administration has to be aware of. Or you're watching for scandals. So Watergate, of course, being a big one. The Vietnam War, once the Pentagon Papers get published and people discover that the various presidents had been lying about America's involvement in Vietnam for years, that becomes a huge scandal. Allegations of sexual harassment. Our current governor dealt with a scandal where it was discovered that he was wearing blackface years ago. In an old college yearbook photo was discovered of him. So that is an example of the media engaging in watchdog, monitoring the behavior of elected officials, making sure they are living up to their promises and watching for scandals. So I just talked about this. There's a necessary relationship between the media and politicians. It's a two-way street. Politicians try to use the media. This is our big platform. This is what we want you to talk about. So if enough politicians talk about an issue, they kind of force the media to deal with it. But the media can do the same thing. They can force the politicians to have a response. This thing is happening. What's your policy solution? So there's that two-way street, that sort of mutually beneficial street. They need each other. We've talked about advertisements before. We've seen some examples of campaign ads. Spot ads are the most common ones. 30 seconds, 1 minute, pretty quick. You don't have time to tell a really nuanced story in a spot ad. You got to get your message across. Make sure that you say your name, what you're running for, give a quick pitch, and then call it a day, because those spot ads, again, you don't have a ton of time to ramble. Most ads end up being negative. Voters always complain. They say they don't like them, but they work. So many campaigns will engage in negative advertising. An infomercial is like 30 minutes to an hour of time. So that would be very different from a spot ad. A spot ad is 30 seconds to a minute. An infomercial is 30 minutes to an hour. One of the first times that this got done was by an independent candidate, not one of the two major parties, but his name was Ross Perot. He was running in 1992, and he bought these huge chunks of time, and he would talk about the national debt and balancing the budget. And because it was the 90s, he would have actual posters that he would point to with his little pointer stick. So Ross Perot used them. It was pretty effective. Perot was very popular for a time. He probably had a shot at being a competitive third-party candidate, but he ended up dropping out of the race. Obama used infomercials when he was running as well. There were a couple times that he bought huge chunks of time. I believe one of them was like right after the Super Bowl, that he bought like an hour of primetime television so that he could speak directly without being taken out of context. And even shorter clips would be a soundbite, down to about 10 seconds of a politician talking. You might use a soundbite of your opponent in your negative spot ad. Take the worst thing that you can find that they've said, take it completely out of context and put it in your spot ad talking about how terrible they are and how they want to kick puppies and stuff like that. And another way politicians will use the media is through a trial balloon. This is where you've got some information, you're not sure how the public is going to react. So you call up some of your favorite reporters and you tell them, hey, you can't quote me on this. You can't quote me by name. You can only say sources close to this politician have told me this piece of information. A lot of times, trial balloons will happen when presidential candidates are choosing their vice president. Someone from the campaign will let it leak. Oh, we're choosing Mr. Holland for the vice presidential candidate. And then they'll watch what the public reaction is. And if it's pretty good, then they'll confirm it and that'll go through. If it's very negative, they'll say, oh, no, we never said that. That's crazy. We would never choose that guy. All right. Last thing for today, let's talk about a few rules that govern the media. Of course, the First Amendment is over it all. The First Amendment is the most important part to the protection that the media enjoys. That's the freedom of the press. In 1934, we get a Communications Act from Congress to create the FCC. The FCC is there to regulate broadcasts. That means radio and then television. And then, of course, they do some regulation of the internet, but not too much. The internet is sort of the Wild West. Broadcasting gets deregulated by the Telecommunications Act of 1996. There's fewer rules now with regulation of broadcasting, the FCC kind of taking a more hands-off approach. One of the things that you can do wrong in the press is called defamation. Defamation is kind of an umbrella term, and included in that are two other vocab words to understand: slander and libel. Typically, libel is the term for when it's the press that's involved, but what we're dealing with here is people saying false things with the goal of hurting another person. People saying false things with the goal of hurting another person. Slander is spoken falsehood. You're just trying to hurt someone's reputation. Libel is printed or broadcasted. These two kind of get lumped in, like I said, to this umbrella term of defamation. If you're trying to prove that someone has committed defamation, there is a very high bar because you have to prove that they acted with intent. So libel, for example, there's two requirements that have to be met for something to be libel. You have to prove that, let's say you're accusing the New York Times of printing something that is libelous. You have to prove that they knew it was false when they printed it. And you have to prove that they printed it with actual malice, with the goal of hurting your reputation. So libel, two requirements for libel. You have to prove that they knew it was false and that it was published with the intent of hurting your reputation. If they made a minor error, like simple human error, that's not libel. You have to prove that they knew it was false and that it was published with actual malice. And that's really difficult. It's a very high bar to prove defamation in court. Typically, courts tend to come down on the side of media organizations. Another rule that the media has to deal with is called prior restraint. This is the government trying to censor something before it is published. It is common, if you're a respected news organization, that you go to the government before you publish a story about them and you lay out what you're about to publish. Hey, tomorrow, this is the story we're running with. Would you like to comment? And at that time, the government may try to censor, may try to prevent you. They may go to court and ask for a court order preventing you from publishing. The most famous case of this, New York Times versus United States. This was the Pentagon Papers. The New York Times was handed these top secret documents about the United States involvement in Vietnam and started publishing them. And the federal government went to court, got a court order to make the New York Times stop, or to attempt to make the New York Times stop. In this case, in front of the Supreme Court said, yeah, sure, the government does have this power of prior restraint, but just like defamation, the bar for prior restraint is incredibly high. It's very difficult to stop a media organization from publishing something. The government will claim they're putting national security at risk by publishing it. If that's the claim you're making, you need to prove whose lives are actually in danger. Right? So the New York Times, they would never do this, but like let's say they got their hands on a list of all of our spies overseas in every country. I don't think the New York Times ever would publish it, but if they were going to, the government would claim, hey, you can't publish that. We're invoking prior restraint because you're trying to publish something that threatens national security. And so that might actually work. But with the Pentagon Papers, for example, there was no one being put in danger. It was just really embarrassing to the government. It just made them look bad. And that doesn't meet that high standard for prior restraint. So prior restraint does exist, but it's incredibly difficult to stop a media organization from publishing something. All right, that's good for today. We will pick up with bias on Tuesday when I see you, and we will go from there. So we'll finish up media on Tuesday. We're going to test on interest groups and media on Wednesday. And then after that, it's just policy, and then it's smooth sailing from there. You've got your must-know quiz, which is on Schoology. Don't forget about that. Facts number 161 through 180. And other than that, I will see you on Tuesday.